It's the summer of 1846, the Mexican-American War is in full swing, and the Americans have crossed the Rio Grande and head towards their objective, the city of Monterrey. On September 19th, the invasion force appears over the horizon and get within sight of the city. Just then, cannon fire from a huge black fort erupted and the Americans stopped at Walnut Springs. From their viewpoint, the Americans were able to admire the beauty of this rich, fertile city, inhabited by 15,000 souls. To the south of Monterrey lay the Sierra Madre Mountains and the Santa Catrina River. The Saltillo Road crossed the jagged landscape into the city and served as a principal avenue of supply for Monterrey. In addition to the Santa Catrina River, there was a narrow stream called the Arroyo Santa Lucia that was north of Monterrey and divided downtown from the suburbs. The army station at Monterrey was the Army of the North, under the command of Lieutenant General Pedro de Ampudia. Preparations for the city's defenses started in July. There was a main focus on the northern and eastern sectors since the Mexicans correctly assumed this would be the approach of the Americans. The fort from which the Americans were fired upon was actually an unfinished church called the Citadel. It was 20 feet high and had a black appearance due to its age and neglect. It had 400 men and 8 guns. Side note, the garrison included 49 American deserters who would go on to form the St. Patrick's Battalion in the future. It would be near impossible to capture this fort without suffering heavy casualties. Fort Teneria had a dominating view of the eastern side of the city's northern plain. It had 200 men and 3 cannons. South of it was Fort Diablo with 200 men and 3 cannons. West of these forts was Purissima Bridge, which was fortified. This was the primary entrance into the city and it was guarded by 300 men and 3 cannons. All of these were formidable positions. However, the Americans benefited from the poor decisions of the Mexican army. On the eve of battle, it was decided to abandon the city, so orders were issued to destroy the fortifications the soldiers and civilians had been working on for months. But then the order was countermanded and the Mexicans had to rebuild the fortifications they had just taken down. So most of the forts were not constructed to their full potential. The Mexicans also fortified 2 main hills on the western side, Independence Hill and Federation Hill. These hills guarded the Saltillo Road. There were 2 strongholds on each hill. On Independence Hill was Fort Libertad and Bishop's Palace, a strong stone structure still in existence today. On Federation Hill lay Fort Federation and a stronger fort called El Soldado, which faced the city. In total, Independence Hill had 200 men and 2 cannons, and Federation Hill had 175 men and 2 cannons. Ampudia stored his gunpowder in the strongest building in the city, and that was the cathedral, which is located in the city's main plaza. Overall, first impressions of the city must have made the Americans nervous. As author Christopher Dishman said, "If a skilled military engineer of the time could move mountains and rivers, he would probably design a city much like Monterrey." Including the forces just mentioned, General Ampudia had 7,300 men under his command. About 2,000 were auxiliaries from Monterrey itself, and they had 40 or so different cannons of different calibers. At Walnut Springs were the Americans under Zachary Taylor. He had 6,200 men with him, of which 2,000 were volunteers. He had his army organized into 3 divisions, 2 regular divisions and 1 composed entirely of volunteers. Texas Rangers were added to the 2nd Division. The commander of the 1st Division would be sick during the battle, so Lieutenant Colonel Garland would take his place instead. On September 19th, a war council decided on a plan of action. Although the city's defenses were formidable, they spotted a weakness. The troops were so spread out, mainly in the city, that the western hills were lightly defended. And although the northern defenses were powerful and close enough to each other to be mutually supporting, the western defenses were far from the city and from each other, that in essence, they were practically isolated. Taylor could pick off these hills one by one. And this was Ampudia's greatest blunder. These hills, once taken, would dominate the Saltillo Road, the main supply line of the Mexican army. Food, supplies, and additional reinforcements would cease to exist once taken, and the Americans could simply starve out the Mexicans. Ampudia should have focused more on this sector. Protecting supply lines are key in winning battles. And so the plan was set. Taylor decided to send Worth's 2nd Division for this flank attack. Meanwhile, he would conduct a feint on the northeast sector to help keep the Mexicans from shifting to the west. On September 20th, Worth's division headed out on a wide semicircle route to be out of range of the Citadel and camps for the night after marching some 7 miles. During the night, Taylor places his heaviest artillery to bombard the Citadel. The next morning, as Worth prepared his troops for battle, he could hear fire from the east and he knew Taylor was beginning his demonstration attack. At 7 a.m., 800 men entered the battlefield in column formation and formed into battle lines, all while receiving intense fire from the batteries that were ahead of them. Despite their efforts and reconnaissance, they had failed to discover Fort Diablo's existence until now. They began to take considerable damage, so they rushed into the suburbs. However, the Baltimore Battalion veered too close to Fort Teneria, and some men broke and routed. Only 70 men reached the city. Fort Tenerife was reinforced with 150 men. Heavy fire fell upon Garland's troops, snipers on rooftops took potshots at them, and the maze-like streets caused the units to be separated and unable to coordinate. Bragg's battery was brought forward to aid the division. However, his battery was ineffective in the streets of Monterrey. The Mexican troops were sheltered behind their defenses, and Bragg could only bring one cannon to the front due to the narrow streets. He pulled back. The Americans soon realized that bringing their field pieces into the street fighting was useless. Artillery would play no major role in this battle. The Purissima Bridge was in front of the 3rd Infantry, and they attempted an ill-fated frontal attack across the stream. They were stopped by the strong defenses and fell back with heavy casualties. However, a company of 44 men were able to sneak up and take shelter in a building in the rear of Tenerife. From there, they harassed the Mexican defenders of the fort. So with the 1st Division in trouble, Taylor began to worry and sent in Butler's 3rd Division to aid in the attack and get Garland's regulars out of the suburbs. But do you see what's happening? What originally was supposed to be a diversionary attack has now suddenly become a full-scale assault against strong enemy fortifications. Before the 3rd Division could form on the field, 3 companies of the 4th Regiment tried to attack Fort Tenerife alone, and it failed miserably, losing a third of its men. So now the 3rd Division shows up and begins to get bombarded. The Tennessee and Mississippi regiments would attack Fort Tenerife, while the Ohio Regiment would try to find another way into the northern part of the city. By now, the men of the Tenerife were thirsty, exhausted, and running out of ammo. They were reaching their breaking point. The volunteers closed in for the kill, and the Mississippians with their Bowie knives were the first to charge the fort. The Tennessee Regiment followed, and Fort Tenerife finally fell. The Ohio Regiment crossed the stream and made some progress. However, with musket fire seemingly from everywhere and confusion among their ranks, they pulled back. The focus now was on Fort Diablo. Together, the Ohio Regiment and the conquerors of Fort Tenerife assaulted Fort Diablo from both sides. Remnants of Garland's division showed up to aid them. Garland's men tried to cross the Purissima Bridge one more time. Just then, the Mexicans were reinforced by the Aguascalientes battalion. Unfortunately for the Americans, the Purissima Fort Diablo line held strong and they were compelled to retreat again. It was now noon. Mejia's 2nd Brigade had much to be proud of. They had repulsed 3 attacks by the Americans, which included the 1st Division, one of the best divisions the Americans had. And then suddenly, without warning, Mexican cavalry appeared and conducted a charge on the withdrawing troops. They slashed at the soldiers who were disorganized and exhausted. It was a pending disaster. Fortunately, the Americans were able to regroup and form a line, which repelled the Lancers. The Lancers then tried to attack the 3 field pieces firing at the Citadel, but the 1st Kentucky formed a square and fought off the horsemen. Bragg's battery, finally being effective on the open plains, helped out and delivered enfilading fire on the cavalry. This was not Taylor at his best. He executed his attack poorly, and he had underestimated his opponent's desire to fight. This diversion cost him 394 casualties, about 14% of the attacking force. In hindsight, there was one benefit. It kept Amputa's attention to this sector and he virtually ignored everything happening to the west. While Taylor's demonstration was occurring, Worth advanced towards Independence Hill. Ahead of him were 1,500 infantry and cavalry waiting for him. Sensing an attack, the Americans formed a battle line. Suddenly, the cavalry charged, but a company of Texas Rangers galloped towards the enemy to break their charge. They were outnumbered 10-1, but the Mexicans had long, unwieldy lances that didn't do well in close quarters combat, especially since the Rangers were armed with 5-shot Colt revolvers. From all the accounts I read, the Americans lost about 100 men while the Texans only lost 1 man, and it was because of friendly fire. This is what happens when you charge a solid battle line with artillery. It was a lopsided victory for the Americans. The rest of the Mexicans retreated. The 2nd Division quickly passed under the guns of Independence Hill, which couldn't depress low enough to shoot at them. Worth decided to take Federation Hill first since it was less defended. He sent 3 assault parties, about 300 men. These men climbed the almost perpendicular slopes covered in rocks and bushes. They made it to the top of the 400-foot hill. Texans competing against Louisianians and regulars to see who could capture the fort first, and by late afternoon, Federation Hill fell to the Americans. A rain squall ended the fighting for that night. All the fighting on the 22nd of September was exclusively with Worth. There would be no diversionary attack by Taylor on the east again, not after what had happened the day before. Worth sent 470 men in 2 assault groups at 3 a.m. They began to creep up the 700-foot hill undetected. Pulling themselves up the steep rugged sides, they neared the top when they were discovered. The Americans attacked, but the 70 troops at Fort Libertad pulled back to the much stronger Bishop's Palace. The palace was reinforced with 50 lancers. The Americans hauled a 12-pound howitzer all the way to the top. Bishop's Pass began to take fire from the howitzer and artillery across the river on Federation Hill. But the garrison still held strong. The Americans were in a jam. How could they draw out the Mexicans? At noon, they planned a ruse and left a single unit to defend the howitzer, a tempting target. Meanwhile, the rest of the men hid on the sides of the hill. It worked. Mexican cavalry charged, and suddenly the trap was sprung. Before the Mexicans could retreat again and lock themselves in, the Americans blasted the door open. By 4 p.m., Bishop's Palace fell, and the American flag was raised. Cheers were given for Monterrey. Worth's 2-day offensive cost him only 43 casualties. So pretty much the battle was going in favor for the Americans, without a doubt. A noose had been formed on Amputa's force. In reality though, Amputa was still well supplied and planning on holding out. The Americans could, in theory, commence a siege and starve out the Mexicans, but Taylor didn't have the time nor the patience for that. Fortunately for the Americans, Amputa's defense strategy was painfully passive, so passive that he pulled back from Purissima and Fort Diablo, the same positions that had held the Americans at bay not long before. He abandoned these advantageous forts to the Americans and withdrew to a tighter perimeter inside the city. September 23rd was a street fighting stage. The Americans would apply pressure on Amputa from both sides. Worth's division would attack from the south and east, while the 1st and 3rd divisions would attack from the north. Intense fire reigned on all sides of the Americans who had never experienced this type of urban warfare. They quickly adopted a strategy taught to them by the Texans, who had over 10 years of fighting experience with the Mexicans. They would find a weakness in the building, usually a door or a boarded window, break inside and climb to the rooftops, and fire on the troops in a neighboring house, and then repeat the procedure again. It was a labor-intensive process, but it worked. A reporter for the New Orleans Picayune wrote, "Inch after inch was taken, but not an inch was given." Slowly but surely, the noose around Amputa's neck got tighter, and the Mexican troops and civilians were pushed closer and closer to the city center, near the cathedral. Worth placed a mortar in a nearby plaza and began to rain shells on the cathedral. Yes, the same cathedral that had 17,000 pounds of explosives. Amputa could finally see the writing on the wall and began talks with Taylor about surrendering the city. Negotiations occurred throughout the 24th. Amputa was demanding generous terms for his surrender. Taylor was in a tough spot. He had the Mexicans surrounded, but his own army was not strong. Probably not even strong enough to prevent a determined breakout by Amputa. And let's not forget the Citadel, which still held out with 400 men. 2 of Taylor's divisions were mauled, and the 3rd was exhausted. His army needed to refit and rest, and Amputa knew it. In the end, a ceasefire was agreed to on the 25th. Taylor made major concessions, allowing the Mexicans to keep their small arms, their horses, and 6 batteries of light artillery. Within a couple days, they would be out of the city. President Polk was outraged at Taylor for letting the enemy escape virtually unscathed, but he was not there. He couldn't see the frontline conditions that Taylor saw. The battle had cost Taylor 504 casualties. That was 136 men killed and 368 wounded. The Mexicans actually lost fewer men in this battle. They suffered 438 casualties, 122 men killed and 316 wounded. So although Mexico had lost a prestigious city, it had not lost its Army of the North. It was far from being a defeated army. It had escaped and would soon return in a climactic effort to retake Monterrey. And you can click here for that video, the Battle of Buena Vista.